Howdy ESSM 406. Today I'm going to give you a short lecture on the 6 P's of environmental policy. This lecture is based on the reading that you have by Salzman. I'm going to add a little bit of detail. And I recommend that you actually read that reading before you watch this lecture, but you can watch this lecture first and then do the reading. Salzman tries to characterize different kinds of environmental policies, and he says that there's 5 kinds. I think he's missing one, so I'll give you 6. The first one he talks about is prescriptive regulation, or what our other readings call command and control regulation. This is when the government tells you what to do, and a lot of our most important environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, laws regulating pesticides, are prescriptive regulations or command and control regulations. These are fairly simple to administer, and they in some ways produce relatively predictable results. They have some disadvantages though. They can be inflexible and they can be costly, and I've discussed those disadvantages in other lectures. The second one that Salzman talks about is property rights. And in property rights, the government basically distributes rights to things. Now, he gives the example used in Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which you read, of dividing up the rights to own the pasture so that it does not get overgrazed. And historically, governments have done things like that. But today, when we talk about environmental policy, we tend to talk about property rights more in terms of cap and trade programs, such as the one that currently exists for sulfur dioxide pollution, as well as tradable fishing permits, as well as things like the law of the sea. And we're not going to talk about it much in this class, but Kosian bargaining, which is something you can go read about or study in an economics class. The advantage of property rights is that they allow the market to work. They often are less expensive to administer, less expensive to run, and they can be more flexible. So they impose less cost on individual firms because firms can choose which strategy they want to use. The problem is they can be very expensive to set up and administer, and some of these cap and trade kinds of programs and tradable fishing permits run into huge costs. They can also lead to hotspots, something I'll talk about in another lecture. Penalties are typically environmental taxes or environmental fines. So the government is going to tax or fine bad environmental behavior. So carbon taxes are frequently discussed. We don't have one. Gas taxes and highway tolls, you could think of them as being a sort of penalty that discourages driving, although actually gas taxes and highway tolls are primarily thought of as a way to pay for building highways and maintaining highways. But they also serve as a discouragement to driving, as do parking costs. And raising water rates, which is something some of you have talked about. So raising the fees that consumers pay for water can lead to less water use. Like property rights, these are economically efficient. They allow the market to work. And in fact, you can think of them in some ways as being basically the same as a cap and trade program. I won't get into the economics of that, but you can work out economically that the costs and benefits and impacts are going to be quite similar for certain kinds of environmental taxes and certain kinds of cap and trade programs. The biggest weakness of these is Americans don't like anything with the word tax in it. I think this is unfortunate because these could actually be very useful tools. The one place where they seem to work are in things like water markets, where we're already accustomed to paying for water. So raising the water rate, raising the electric rate to pay for certain kinds of infrastructure investment makes sense to us in a way that other kinds of taxes often do not make sense to Americans. The flip side of penalties are payments, or I tend to think of them as subsidies. So the government is going to pay you to do something good. So the natural resource conservation programs have lots of subsidies in them. Americans love subsidies as long as someone else is paying for it. So we don't like taxes, but we love subsidies. That's a little inconsistent. Someone's got to pay the tax to pay the subsidy. One of the other problems with payments is that payments often turn out to be given for subsidies tend to be given to things that are maybe not necessarily such a great idea. So grazing on national forests is controversial, and the fees that people who have permits to graze on national forests are so low they essentially amount to a subsidized grazing. So if people wanted to graze their cattle elsewhere, they'd have to pay much higher fees. And some people would argue, well, we shouldn't be giving these subsidies. Uh, and you can think of many other examples where, in fact, we're subsidizing bad environmental behavior. So eliminating subsidies could be a way to improve environmental behavior. All right, persuasion. He says the government tries to persuade you, sometimes merely by providing information and sometimes by doing things that are persuasive. So you can think of the Energy Star program. When you go to buy a large appliance, appliances that are energy efficient have a star on them. That's actually a program run by the Environmental Protection Agency to let you know what appliances will be relatively more efficient. Smokey the Bear is a different kind of persuasion. Smokey the Bear tries to persuade you to put out your fires, right? So that's like trying to convince you to do something. So this is good because it's not coercive. All the things we talked about before have some element of coercion in them. But this is just giving you information. Problem is sometimes the effects of these can be very small. You can think that telling people about the efficiency of their appliances might be less effective than requiring them to buy efficient appliances, which would be a prescriptive regulation, or raising the cost of energy so they have an incentive to save energy. Now, you'll notice that the last four I've talked about are all in green. And so these are all things that I consider to be market-based approaches, as opposed to the first, which is a prescriptive regulation or a command and control regulation. And in this assignment that you have for Unit 3.1, you're kind of supposed to compare the two. I'm going to talk about one more P, and that P is provision. This is a little bit different and doesn't fit quite as well into this assignment. But provision is when the government just does it. So the classic example of provision are parks, wildlife refuges, state and national forests. You can also think of building reservoirs to supply water. Can be done by private companies, but often the government builds the reservoir. These are much easier to set up in a lot of ways than these other kinds of programs. The government just does it. It's not coercive, and it has many advantages in some situations. But it can be costly to run. Certain problems are not well suited to government fixing. And certain people don't like the idea of government doing things, even in situations where it might actually be more effective for the government to do it. Now that runs the gamut of what Salzman considers the environmental policy instruments. In the next part of this unit, in Unit 3.2, which is separate, we're actually going to talk about some things that don't fit here very well, but are very widely used. So this isn't everything that exists out there, but this is a good start.